software services firm based in Spokane, where you are, meaning we're local. So you need some services, software architecture, design, technology leadership. You need us to tell your boss what to do, give us a call. So that user group, most of you RSVP'd, so you know about the meetup group. Tell your neighbors, tell your friends. Let's get more people involved, more people showing up. I think the last few meetings, thanks to some support staff, certainly not me, like Aaron and friends, have done a good job getting the word out and helping get our people involved. I mean, we love doing the meetings, but we don't love doing the meetings to ourselves. So when people show up, it's great. We're also on the web, but not at that URL until somebody gets it put back together again. And there will be a survey up there if I ever get it up again. I guess I got to do it now that I've said it.
We do have a survey on the meetup site too.
What's that? It says here. Oh, there it is. Okay, so events. We do host and conduct events from time to time. We actually helped sponsor a Scrum training last week, which went really well. In fact, I've just been here, Seth. He says he liked it, so must have been good, right? We're holding an Azure DevOps Community Launch event tomorrow. We're actually sold out, so I don't think even if you want to come, you probably should, because we're like sold out. So that's awesome. And we're talking about doing an Office 365 Developer Bootcamp. At least I'm talking about it. I don't know if anybody else is, but if you're interested in Office 365 development, specifically SharePoint framework, Teams is kind of hot these days with bots and extensions and et cetera. If that's something that interests you, please let us know and we'll schedule it. We'll get something on the calendar. Anything else, reach out to one of us, get in touch. We're happy to talk about anything. Also, Startup Spokane, check them out. They do a real nice job in the community, helping to foster startups, innovation, and et cetera. And they have, this is their space, and you can rent it out hourly, daily, et cetera, to do stuff. So check them out. And then lastly, meet Kevin. Say hi, Kevin.
Hi.
He's going to be presenting tonight. Senior software engineer at Intelitech, the Xamarin certified developer, and of course he's an all-around good guy. We'll get to it. Right? All right. Cheers. Yes. Can't do that from my phone.
Okay, I want to thank you guys all for coming out. I'm going to apologize up front. My voice is dying. My daughter gave me a cold over the weekend, and I've been talking for the last several hours. So we are going to see how long I can do this. Does anyone here know ASL? Yes, perfect. My fallback plan. So hopefully it doesn't come to that, and we can actually get all the way through this. I'm really excited tonight to talk about Xamarin Forms. This is one of my favorite frameworks to work with. People who have been around me long enough know that I love XAML. I love being able to do WPF, and being able to take that same skill set and bring it in to the mobile world has been amazing. So ultimately what we're here to answer is, should you use Xamarin Forms for your next app? I mean, that's really the question. There's a lot of mobile frameworks out there. Should you use Xamarin Forms or should you use something else? Okay. So first, just kind of catching everyone up to speed. What is Xamarin? Several years ago, Microsoft purchased Xamarin, the company, and it became their mobile platform for building mobile applications. There are several different ways to use Xamarin to target different platforms. There's Xamarin Android for Android apps, Xamarin iOS for iOS, and then there's also Xamarin for Mac. And then with Xamarin Forms, you can also target UWP. WPF is in preview and coming. For tonight, I'm going to constrain myself to just Xamarin Android and Xamarin iOS, because for the vast majority of people, that's what they're interested in doing. They're wanting to build an iOS, they're wanting to build an Android app, and with Forms, they're hopefully wanting to share a bunch of code so that they don't have to end up duplicating all of that work multiple times over. So for me, if you hear me use the word Xamarin Native, that's what I'm referencing, is the combined idea of Xamarin Android and Xamarin iOS together. Okay? Now I assume because this is a .NET user group that most of us here have a background in .NET. Some experience in C#. For me, I love it, and I think it is one of the best languages to build in. So instantly being able to take my C# knowledge and build an Android and iOS app with Xamarin Android or Xamarin iOS is a quick win. I can go through and build the same shared library like I can already, and then share that across Xamarin, iOS, and Android. But that only gets us part of the way there. Sure, it's great to go through and share all of my C# code, but I'm still ultimately building an app that way. I'm still using storyboards on iOS. I'm still using the native Android themes and editing those files the same as a native app developer would go through and do. So this is where Xamarin Forms comes into play. Most of the time, when you're building an app, you don't have largely different UIs. Or to say it a different way, you don't have largely different user experiences between your Android and your iOS apps. Sure, the look and feel should be different. An Android app should feel like an Android app. It should be in that material design. An iOS app should feel like an iOS app. Xamarin Forms is not common UI. It's shared UI code, but it is not a common UI. This is most commonly the feedback I hear from people is, oh, we can't do Xamarin Forms. We need to do platform-specific stuff. And you can do that. Xamarin Forms lets you take that code, write it once, and share it on multiple platforms. You can still get the platform look and feel. You can still do custom stuff for each platform. But you can now share your code. In the apps that we've built with it, we can easily share upwards of 93% and more of the code that we've done. Those are just the last two apps Intelitech has helped build. We have shared that much code across multiple platforms. Having to go through and rewrite that on each platform would have been a huge time sink. And on all of those, the app still feels like an Android app, or still feels like an iOS app, because that's what it should do. Okay? Take something simple like a tab control. And I hope this is somewhat visible. On iOS, I expect my tabs to show up along the bottom. They should have their icon. They should have some text. The user expects to be able to tap on those and navigate between those views. On Android, the story is quite different. No icon. We don't want to see that. I expect my tabs along the top. It should look like material design. It should follow the user's theme preferences. The user's picked dark theme. It should follow that. But yet, when I'm writing my UI with Xamarin Forms, I write one tab page. I write it once. I define what I want my user experience to be, and then I let Xamarin Forms make it native on both of the platforms. Okay. So the big claim from Xamarin is that when you are writing, you are getting a native app. So when you guys hear native, what do you hear? What does native mean? Don't everyone jump at once. I'm trying to give my voice a rest.
Written specifically for.
Written specifically for. Okay? If you're writing a native app, what do you hope to do?
Performance.
Native performance. What else?
I wanted to implement features specific to that device.
So features specific to that device, or that device's specific APIs, platform features. Yes. What else? Someone touched on it before. Native UIs. So with Xamarin Forms, you want a native user experience. When I do a button in Xamarin Forms, I want it to look like an iOS button. More importantly, I want it to look like an iOS button regardless of what version of iOS I'm running. The same goes with Android. If I'm on an older Android device, I expect Material Design 1 theme. If I'm on a newer Android device, I want the new Material Design 2. I expect that behavior. But I still only want to write one button. I don't want to have to reduplicate the same login button in multiple places. I also want access to all of the same native APIs. There's no reason I should be limited just because I'm building in Xamarin Forms. And you aren't. With Xamarin, specifically Xamarin Native, you have access to every single public API on every platform. There is no difference between what a native app developer can access excuse me, and what you can access using Xamarin. You get access to everything. This even extends beyond just the regular platform SDKs. If your buddy's built an iOS library and distributed via CocoaPods, written in Objective-C, you can actually leverage that inside of your Xamarin app. Now, it's not the simple add NuGet package that all of us .NET developers are used to doing. There's some extra work you have to do to actually leverage it. But you can take advantage of third-party libraries that were written with native code. And you can do that inside of Xamarin. Okay. Xamarin apps also get native performance. And this is one of the hardest things to actually go through and prove or measure out. Because you'll look online and you'll find all these different performance benchmarks about how is my Xamarin app doing, or how does Xamarin Forms do compared to a native app. Because that's one of the big things people care about is, okay, is my app going to feel sluggish simply because I wrote it in Xamarin? The answer is pretty unlikely not. So when you look at those, there's a few different things that people measure. One, to try and do apples to apples, they'll measure, okay, how long does it take me to do thing X? For example, deserialize a blob of JSON. That's something that's pretty common. You invoke some website, you get a bunch of JSON back. How long does it take me to deserialize that? And in these cases, because we're in C#, we can take advantage of JSON.NET, which is highly performant. And in some cases, the C# will outperform the native app. But that's a very small picture of the entire app's life cycle. When you're building a Xamarin app, you essentially have two runtimes. And I'm using the term runtime very loosely here. On one side, you've got the native runtime. So we'll take iOS, for example. A native iOS developer writes their code in Swift or Objective-C. This is not a garbage collected language. It's a manual memory management. Yes, they have things like Arc to try and help you out, but in the end, you're still calling malloc and dealloc yourself. You now have C# running on iOS. C# has a garbage collector. It's not the exact same garbage collector that you're used to in .NET Core, .NET Framework. It's called SGen. It's been slightly modified from the other ones to work better on mobile. But it is essentially a similar garbage collector. Jumping that boundary, going between managed C# land and native iOS land incurs a performance hit. It's no different than if you were to p-invoke into a Windows library. There's some amount of performance hit to be able to jump that barrier. But once you jump that barrier, you're running in native land no different than any other native app. So when Xamarin says native performance, that's what they're talking about, is we can run with the same performance that those native apps can do. But because there is that performance hit, and because we have that garbage collector, there are some extra hits that come along with it. On Android, it's a similar story. But rather than no garbage collector, you've got a garbage collector on both sides. And you still have that hit to jump back and forth. And occasionally you do have to deal with this idea of, is this a managed object that I'm working with that I need to actually care about? Most of the native objects will come with an iDisposable interface, just like you would if you were dealing with any sort of Win32 library, where you have to dispose of them so that the native land knows, okay, I can release this. Are you actually done with it? The other one that people will measure a lot is app startup time. And this is one of the areas where Xamarin Forms fails miserably if you start to compare raw numbers back and forth. I think some of the ones I've seen show upwards of 200 to 300 milliseconds slower. Now, for some apps, that matters. For a huge percentage of apps, it doesn't. If your app takes 200 to 300 milliseconds longer to load, does that matter? Most of the time, the answer is no. Are users going to care if they're seeing a splash screen for a few hundred extra milliseconds in exchange for the development speed? That's one of the big trade-offs that you're getting with Xamarin Forms, is development time and speed, time to market. That matters a lot. So, if raw performance numbers are what matter the most to you, maybe don't necessarily look directly at Xamarin Forms, because there is a performance penalty to going through and starting. But when it comes to just how does the app feel when I'm using it, when I'm flicking through my list, do I get my nice fast scrolls and does the thing bounce when I hit the bottom? Answer, yes. You get those native controls. They run with native performance. They are that fast. It's not like the JavaScript emulated mobile environments where they're having to do a whole bunch of extra stuff and it doesn't quite feel native. Okay, so why use Xamarin Forms? Most obvious, straight up development speed. Sharing your C# code is an instant win. Sharing your UI code on top of that, another big win. Xamarin Forms is constantly kicking out updates. This time last year, we were sitting on version 2.4.0, service release 5. In that time, they've kicked out 6 major releases. We're at 3.3.0 current, and as of this afternoon, the project manager said 3.4.0 is expected to be released later this week. So if I can take the rest of the week, I can say they've gotten 7 major releases out in a year. They are very responsive to bugs, and things get fixed very rapidly. This is very important when you're looking at reviews online of people saying this and that about Xamarin Forms. The dates matter. Because if you compare where Xamarin Forms was a year ago to where it is now, it is leaps and bounds better and faster and different. So if you're seeing critiques of people on Xamarin or Xamarin Forms, check the dates. Those matter a lot. Take a second look at Xamarin Forms, especially for all the people who say, oh, it's too slow, we can't use it. Maybe about a year ago that was true. It has gotten much better since then. The other big advantage of Xamarin Forms, I come from a WPF background. I like my C#, I like my XAML. I like being able to build things that way. The problem is with Xamarin iOS and Xamarin Android, you're still forced to know the native APIs. You have to know, how is an Android app structured? What is the app lifecycle? How do I manage it? Same thing with iOS. And for Xamarin Android and Xamarin iOS, that's expected. Their job is to surface out all of that native functionality and richness, change the names a little bit so that they don't read like Objective-C method names and they read like a nice C# name. But there's a one-to-one mapping between a native iOS API and a Xamarin iOS API. With Xamarin Forms, they're not constrained by that limitation. They can smooth over those platform oddities. We can make things look and feel more like C#, and to some degree, you can treat platform differences with impunity. It's very easy to go through and build stuff that feels nice and easy and not have to worry about platform bits. Documentation. This is one of those areas that often doesn't get enough credit. The docs team at Microsoft has been on fire this last year. They can churn out updates and produce new docs and examples faster than any other team I think I've ever seen. Specifically, and actually I'm going to jump out and show you guys this one real quick because this is important to take a look at. So, docs.microsoft.com, okay? Wonderful website, learned to love it. And straight into Xamarin, okay? There are tons of references and examples to dive through here. Two very important ones that I want to call your attention to. Right at the bottom, on the left, there's a mobile application book. Xamarin has put out an entire ebook on how do I build a Xamarin Forms app from start to finish, going through all of the fundamentals. You can download it in PDF, EPUB, and something other. I think you can just browse it straight up on the web too. There's also, for those of you guys building apps for enterprise type situations, there's an enterprise book that goes into more detail on Xamarin Forms of how do I handle security? How do I handle going across from my internal network to my external? Wonderful resources to go through and use. Okay. And I've lost my screen. Oh. Turns out when you're on a different desktop, it matters. Okay. So then, enough of me singing Xamarin's praise. What is Xamarin Forms really bad at? Because again, the ultimate question is, should you use Xamarin Forms for your app? And so yes, it is great for a lot of things, but it is not great for everything. It's not a silver bullet. So one, I'm going to make the assumption that because this is a .NET user group, that your team likely has some experience with .NET. If you have a team that actually has experience building native mobile applications with Objective-C, Java, it may not be the best investment of time. Okay? But if you've got a team that's already familiar with C#, maybe has some experience with XAML, this is a great option. Okay? Xamarin Forms is not built to do games. It really isn't. If you want to go through and build a mobile game, there are much better frameworks out there. Unity, Horo Sharp, Monogame, all of those are much better options. Now secretly, under the hood, all of those options are still using the Mono runtime on iOS and Android. So they're still built on top of the same runtime that Xamarin iOS and Xamarin Android are using. But they're giving you a nice framework for physics, particles, collision detection, that sort of thing, to actually be able to build a game that runs on those platforms. This is one that I hear about all the time and have never seen. It's like one of those elusive birds. People tell me all the time, oh, we can't use Xamarin Forms. Our UIs are too different between iOS and Android. And if I ever come across one of these cases where that's actually true, that would be a good reason to not use Xamarin Forms. I've yet to come across that case. Usually when people say that they've got highly divergent UIs, what they really mean is, I want it to look like iOS here, I want it to look like Android here. I want my Roberto font on Android, but I want San Francisco or Helvetica on my iOS. Great, you get that already. What's the problem? So again, if by some chance you actually have an app where your UIs are going to be vastly different between iOS and Android, that would be a reason to skip Xamarin Forms. Maybe look at the Xamarin native options, but ignore Xamarin Forms. I would really question it though. I've yet to find a company's app where they don't want their users to feel at home between iOS and Android. It just doesn't happen in practical. High-end performance. I commented that Xamarin Forms does have a performance hit. There is an extra hit. You've got this common UI layer in Xamarin Forms that you're working with, and then you've got a native layer, and you've got this translation between them. There is a hit for doing that. There is a startup hit for loading Xamarin Forms. Is it enough to warrant not using it? Not usually. But if you have an app where you actually care to squeeze every possible millisecond out of your performance that you can, that would be another good reason to avoid Xamarin Forms. Now, with that said, I still would say suggest Xamarin Native. Kelly?
Are the apps bigger too, because you have the Xamarin runtime along with the APK or?
Absolutely. There is a size increase by using Xamarin. Now, when you compile in release mode to deliver to the store, that size difference gets dramatically smaller. They don't bundle the entire .NET framework in with your app. Most of it is trimmed off with a linker so that if it's an API you aren't using, it just goes away. And that's great, but there is still extra size that goes along with it. Again, we have a runtime, we have a garbage collector. That takes up some extra space. Okay? Okay. Problem areas. For those of you who have ever done native app development and have had to use Xcode, there is a wonderful site called Text from Xcode where the author outlines all kinds of fun errors that he gets with Xcode. It's hilarious. I'll let that one run through for a moment. So when building with Xamarin, the tool chain is highly complex because in addition to C#, Microsoft, Visual Studio, all of those compilers, we have all the same native tools under the hood. To build an iOS app, you have to compile on a Mac. Apple lawyers have deemed it so. For Xamarin iOS to actually be able to compile that app and you work from Visual Studio and Windows, you have to have a remote, I don't know what they call it, remote desktop assistant tool that Xamarin installs when you install their tool chain that Visual Studio connects to.
Build agent?
Yeah, some build something or another on it. I'm blanking on the name. But it has to run on the Mac using the Mac tool chain to compile your iOS app. There's no way around it. All of the same problems that the native app developers run into when building apps, Xamarin app developers get those plus anything that Xamarin adds to it. So it's not this happy hunting ground of, oh, we're using Xamarin, now we don't have to deal with these other problems that these other app developers face. No, 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 we have those problems plus a few extra. Okay? Android is notoriously bad at this. So when you go through to install Xamarin, please, 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 please follow the directions on docs.microsoft.com. Install with the Visual Studio installer, check the workload for mobile development, it'll do everything right. If you follow directions outside of that, you can get your system into a very bizarre state. This is somewhat on Google's fault and somewhat on Microsoft's fault. The Xamarin stuff makes assumptions about what folder paths your JDKs will be installed into, and Xamarin doesn't help that problem in the least. So if you install in some wacky extra path, putting it on a separate drive, most of the time it kind of works, but then you run into weird problems where different Xamarin tools just fall over because they're expecting JDKs installed in particular paths. I highly recommend you take the defaults when you do the install. There is a tool to actually manage your Android SDKs inside of Visual Studio. Use it. It will save you a lot of headache. Don't follow the normal directions of what you'll see online of people talking about Android Studio. The moment you see that reference, move on, find a different article. That's not the one for you. Okay? Protected internal. This is somewhat specific to the Xamarin Forms library. Because remember, we've got Xamarin Native, and then on top of that, we have Xamarin Forms. You can interact with the native class library like you would any other C# library. A consistent problem is to avoid having public APIs that they don't want to support. Xamarin marks a significant number of their classes and methods protected internal, which means hands off, you can't touch this outside of fancy reflection or cheating some internals visible to Jenkins. Okay? This has bitten me many, many times of needing to go in and just modify something and don't have direct access to it. This is something that has slowly been getting better with Xamarin Forms, though, over the last year. I've got various libraries that I've written that their sole purpose in life is to go and get me access to that one thing that you said I couldn't touch. And each version of Xamarin that comes out, I have to go and check. Okay, did they change anything? Is this broken? Because protected internal, they aren't required to match that API at all. They can change it all they want. As far as they're concerned, that's internal to them. The only consumer is them. Okay. The other major problem that I hit consistently with Xamarin Forms is really, really bad error messages. Ones that typically don't tell you what is wrong. And again, this isn't completely on Xamarin. Some of it is they're surfacing error messages coming out of the native platform or native platform tools, and they're just absolute garbage. Or they reference tools that are internal that you don't have access to. Typically, a simple restart of Visual Studio gets everything back into a happy state, clean, rebuild, everyone's fat, dumb, and happy. The problem is that takes time, especially when we're talking about building on a remote Mac, where you have to send data across a bigger app. That starts slowing down your development cycle. On Xamarin Forms specifically, there are some cases in your XAML where if you don't add the correct tag, you get an error message back and it doesn't tell you what tag you forgot. It just says you're missing an attribute. Great. Where? Tell me the tag name, a line number, something, and you get nothing back out of it. And you're forced to, binary search with comments to get it through. Again, this is something that for the Xamarin stuff has been getting better. If you hit these errors, check on GitHub. Most of them have been reported. Most of them have been triaged. A lot of them have been fixed and are coming in future releases. The last several that I found have already been fixed. So I'm running out of examples of this to show because they're actually fixing them rapidly. Okay. The other major problem, who here likes ReSharper? CodeMate or somewhere. I see a couple of ReSharper hands. Yeah, ReSharper will not help you. In fact, ReSharper will actively lie to you. Not in your C#, but in the XAML and Xamarin Forms. For JetBrains, Xamarin Forms looks like a moving target that they are having trouble hitting. And so as ReSharper updates come out, Xamarin Forms is iterating fast enough that JetBrains can't keep up. I was talking to one of their developers several months ago, and that was the complaint that they said is, we can't keep up with how fast they're iterating on things. And so as they're adding features to their XAML, ReSharper has no idea about them. And a lot of times reverts back to thinking that you're doing WPF or UWP XAML, which is really, really unhelpful here. And so it'll actively suggest things that are just plain wrong. So in your XAML, don't trust ReSharper. I currently leave it on and like it, but I get squiggly lines in my XAML and I just have to trust that when I compile, no errors, everything's okay. So those are the major problem points that I've run into with Xamarin Forms. Does it make me not love it or not want to use it? Absolutely not. For the vast majority of apps, Xamarin Forms is a great choice. Okay? Questions? I could have been that good. Wow. Did you drop my display?
Okay.
Yes.
Do you have examples of the apps that IntelliTech has made, or are those like private?
So the answer is yes, and Aaron's gonna kill me.
I'm gonna kill you.
After the talk, how it
Yeah.
Not during.
My recording had stopped, so we're
Oh,
gonna start
no.
again. That's awesome.
It's okay, I have Sam on here.
I must have hit the wrong button. So the answer is yes. So one, there is Stay Alfred. You can punch it up on the iOS or Google Play stores. It is a free app, I believe. Looking at Jared to make sure I'm not speaking out of turn. There are two other apps by Olive Tree Bible Software.
that we actively worked on. You will find them under the Zondervan Study Bible and, oh boy, CWSB, and Common Word Study Bible, I think is the name of it. Neither of those are free apps though. But if you want to take a look at what the UIs look like, you can, if nothing else, you can always flip through the previews on the store. The one thing I'll point out is look at those UIs and tell me if just from the screenshots you can tell if that's a Xamarin app or not. I'd be willing to bet the answer is no.
What was the first one?
Stay, Alfred.
One thing about that is we do kind of like a hotel, like travel apartments in big cities, and that's what we're selling. So a lot of the screen you come into, you got to put a reservation number in. That reservation, you really dig into the app itself. So you can look through some of the example screenshots and stuff, or go make reservations and stay in one of the places. Even better. So yeah.
Friends and family discount.
Yep.
So if it wasn't clear, our local Stay Alfred representative, I guess.
And call it also.
Oh yes.
Kentucky.
So let's get this guy. Why did it drop my display? I am not sure why it disconnected me. Still shows it there. Connecting, thinking, something that resembles a Visual Studio solution. Well, Kelly's cheating with source code. Oh, this is not where we're going. So for those of you who are interested in actually following along versus just watching, there is a GitHub repo out there. I know that Aaron sent it out. Unless you've pulled, let's see, post 6:15, you probably need to pull again.
And I'll say real quick, if you need Wi-Fi, it's written on the wall right there, co-work at Central, all lowercase.
So I'll leave that up there for a moment. So what I want to, assuming my voice holds out well enough, what I wanted to do is actually walk through looking at a Xamarin Forms app. So one of the other developers at Intelitech, Grant, I think he's spoken at several of these, a long time ago, using a weird technology called Microsoft Cordova, he built an app. Now Grant is primarily a web developer. He's really good with his JavaScript. He likes building things, making things look pretty. And Cordova was a great option because it lets you take those web skills that you have and transfer that straight into an app. The problem with Cordova is it's basically embedding a web browser for your app and running some JavaScript and HTML. That works great, but it's a common UI. You get the exact same look and feel on iOS as you do on Android. And more importantly, he's run into the problem that as iOS and Android progress forward, he needs to be compiling against the newer and newer SDKs, and his tool chain's been rapidly getting out of date. So I told him, I was like, hey, tell you what, I'll rewrite your app in Xamarin Forms. We'll go through it for this talk, and then maybe he'll like it, maybe he won't. I hope he doesn't take it wholesale, because some of these things have been done intentionally to show off Xamarin Forms features rather than making something holistic and nice. Okay? So please ask questions as we work our way through this. The other thing on the README at the root of that repo, I've put in a bunch of links for all of the resources and things that I've mentioned earlier. So if you're wanting quick links to dive into those, that is a great place to go. The other thing worth knowing is I have also put the PowerPoint slides up on the Git repo because I'm a developer and everything goes in Git for reasons. Okay. And that works. Okay, so presenter mode. Turn on. Thinking. Spelling counts. Okay. That's closer to where I was going. Let's make sure I'm not missing anything on my notes. Okay. Is that readable by people? Somebody backish? Cool, I'm getting head nods. Okay. So, if you do decide to go through and install the Xamarin workload, like I said, do it from the Visual Studio installer. It will take a while. There's a lot of extra stuff to install. For those of you who've been paying really close attention, this is not a Mac. I'm very much a Windows guy. And unfortunately, rather than dragging my Mac down here, I'm going to do some hand waving, and we're going to just trust that Mac works. Because the code that we're going to write isn't going to be in the iOS project. It's not going to be in the Android project. It's going to be in the shared project. That way, it just works on both. So we're going to trust that Xamarin Forms actually works. Okay? So when you go through to create a Xamarin Forms project, it will give you a couple choices. Now, back in ye olden days, there was PCL projects and shared asset projects. Okay? PCL is largely deprecated at this point. So moving forward, you should use net standard. It's the proper way to share code, and it's the way this has been set up. Okay? There is still a shared asset project. And what that ends up doing is the files that you create in the shared asset project isn't really a project. So when you compile a net standard library, you actually get a DLL out of this thing. It bundles all the code up into an assembly and makes it for you. With a shared asset project, you don't get that. A shared asset project is a fancy way of doing file linking in bulk. So it'll take those files and link them in to the iOS and Android project, and then you do pound-if, just like you do pound-if debug. You can do pound-if Android, pound-if iOS, and do platform-specific code, one after the other. Some people really like this method because it's really easy to switch between iOS and Android code right in line. I find it horribly difficult to manage because I'm switching context right in line. So, to each his own, but my preference is definitely going with the net standard approach and dealing with having to go back and forth to the iOS and Android when necessary. When you create a new project, you will notice it builds up what are called heads. In my case, when I created the project, I only selected the iOS and Android. Again, there are other options to be able to say, hey, I want to target UWP as well. Because if I wanted to also target the Windows Store in addition to Google Play and iTunes, you can do that. But because iOS and Android is the most common, that's where we're going here. This is also a great example of ReSharper just flat out lying to you. That exists. The problem is that class exists during the compile process. There's Xamarin tools that go through and generate all kinds of extra Android-specific classes and files for you. ReSharper gets horribly confused. So when you see these errors, trust me, the whole project does compile. You can pull it down on your system if you don't believe me. Okay? The key part to each of these heads, meaning iOS and Android, are these two calls right here. Now, you don't have to write this code. When you do a new Xamarin Forms project, it'll build this out for you. But the important part is the init call on line 21, and then the load application on line 22. This is what actually gets Xamarin Forms running, because Xamarin Forms has to run inside of a native application. So each of the native apps generate and run. So those of you who are familiar with Android apps will notice that normally you have multiple activities. They roughly correspond to screens or things that you do inside of your app. For a Xamarin Forms app, your app is one activity. Maybe two if you have extra entry points for notifications or something, but for the most part, you have a single activity app. And then you go into Forms land, and Forms manages everything from there. The similar thing comes with iOS. For those familiar with iOS, App Delegate is the rough equivalent of activity, kind of. It manages your entire application as far as application events, starting, suspended, that kind of thing. But it also goes through same forms init call, same load application. So let's actually go and look at this app that it's using. So you'll notice I'm now done with my platform-specific code. I wrote none of it. It's all going into my shared project. For those people familiar with UWP or WPF, this structure probably looks somewhat familiar. We've got our app.xaml, and I've got ReSharper trying to parse it because reasons. Okay, let's get some space here. And in our, of course I opened the wrong file. And in our app class, it simply creates a navigation page, pushes our main page onto the navigation stack, and sets it as the main page. When you create your Xamarin Forms project, the template will ask you, what kind of default navigation do you want for your app? Because most apps fall into one of several cases. You want some sort of navigation stack where you're pushing things on, popping things off, moving through. Some apps want the default master detail type hamburger menu, open, close. In this case, we're just going with the straight navigation one. There are several different pages. Again, on those docs, they go through and outline all of the various controls and everything that's available to you. So now, before we dive too much deeper into here, let's actually go through and look at what this other app is. I'm going to back up here. So this other app written by Grant, again, was written in Cordova, which is convenient for us because we can now look at what the app was supposed to do. So pretend like this web browser is somehow embedded inside of a phone application. So it's a pretty simple app. You fire it up, and you get something that looks kind of like this, which is great. Okay, it's a few menus to dive in and pick from. And if we go through and pick on it, we'll start with our cut list, which is the top one. So for those people who don't operate wood mills, being able to go through and measure out where do I cut my boards at, how long, the whole point of this app is to try and make that process easy for you and avoid mistakes because you're trying to do math in your head with weird fractions. And I'm bad at math, so this is helpful. So you'll notice we can even play with the app a little bit if we go through and click on it. Change some of the fractions. We get a little list down here at the bottom. It kind of works. Okay. Again, this is meant to be a Cordova app. We aren't inside of Cordova, so we only get what little the JavaScript and HTML will come from. So let's see. What would it take to actually put this into cancel? Why did you? Oh, multiple desktops can be a pain. So let's take a look at what we actually have. So who here has any experience with XAML? See a couple hands. I know I have a couple students here. All their hands should be up. For Xamarin Forms, you can build your UI with just straight C#. It is very possible to go through and build up that tree structure of your UI in C#. I do not recommend it. You give up all of the benefits of XAML and gain very little. Now, XAML comes with a learning curve. When I go in and tell people this, don't assume that you're just going to dive in and start using this right out the gate. For me, it was easy. I come from a WPF background. I fully acknowledge that I am weird. I've got at least a couple votes. Most people will admit. And for those people who didn't pay attention, I even brought my own code monkey because I had to. Oh yes, it is the same shirt. Matching code monkey. Why would I bring just some random monkey? I should not be considered the normal case. XAML is worthwhile learning, though. Being able to build an app out this way and being able to debug and step through and look at this UI is much easier than doing it in C#. I've tried to do it both ways, and I promise you, the XAML way is much, much easier. I was working on an app that tried to build its entire UI in C# the other day, and it was painful to work through.
So what about the other end of the spectrum? You know, in the early days of XAML, there was the infamous designer, which I think is still vested, is not quite been swept away. Right. So are there alternatives for designers to go in and
Designers to go in. When you mean designer, do you mean I want to look at what my app will look like designer, or do you mean designer as in I've got long hair and a ponytail and I want to make the app pretty?
Sure. Because they're going to use the guy with the ponytail or girl with the ponytail is going to use the tooling as opposed to opening up XAML.
Mm-hmm. So at least I've only worked with 2 professional designers when it comes to mobile app design. There's various different solutions that they end up using. InDesign, I'm trying to remember what the other one was. Yellow submarine icon, and I can't picture the name of it. But there's not a great story to say, take designer file, make my XAML out of it. I know that's something the Xamarin team has looked at doing, but there's nothing there now. Now, as far as tooling for actually going through and seeing this, there are sort of 2 options Xamarin offers. There's the XAML Live Preview. So you could open up and get a preview of what your app might look like in your XAML while you're editing it. The problem is, it's a preview of what your app might look like. There's 0 guarantees that your app will even come close to that when it gets to running on an actual device. Because every device is going to be a little bit different. You've got form factors that matter. You've got theme that matter. The preview is not a great option. Then they also have the Xamarin Live Preview. Because let's reuse the same term over and over. Where you install an app on your device and you connect that device to your Visual Studio, and as you're editing your XAML, you're seeing that actually run on the device. So now it's no longer guesswork of what might this look like on a device, it's what does this currently look like on my device. The problem is, I have had a lot of trouble getting it to work. I tried to set it up on my devices to show it for tonight, and after 2 hours, I gave up because I was so frustrated with it. So I have seen demos, and it looks cool. And if you get it to work, let me know what you did.
Do you know if you're able, say you're trying to write for a bunch of different devices, can you do like the browser link thing where you hook it to 5 or 6 devices? And
it only connects to one at a time. So it shows up ultimately under your debug menu here, just like any other target. And so I think it actually, does mine show up? Yeah, Live Player, but I don't have any devices connected to it. Underneath Live Player, you'll see an extra menu of, here's my Live Player devices, and you pick the one you want it to go out to. And so it's supposed to work and work well, and I just cannot seem to get it to work.
So
now,
in that scenario, if you actually had it to work some future day, and you connect it to multiple devices, you can switch the devices and then it'll sync up
to which one that you're on. Yeah.
So you can get it working here, then see what it looks like on the next one, and see what it looks like on the next one.
Absolutely. And that's worth noting when you're doing mobile development, and this is not just for Xamarin, this is for any mobile development, you must absolutely test on real devices. Development is fine against emulators and simulators, but it is never going to match with the actual devices. You must test on real devices. So any test of consequence should be on a real device. Okay? So I am not going to spend a lot of time going through the XAML and just boring everybody to bits. So let's actually do something more interesting and start this thing up. And this is where we're going to run. You'll see references. You'll see references that at one point in time, Microsoft put out their own Android emulators. Those are now deprecated because Google emulators actually got fast enough. The only reason Microsoft put one out is because the Google emulators were so slow that it was painful to develop against. The other problem was that these emulators work off of VirtualBox technology. For anybody on Windows who's done virtualization stuff, they know that VirtualBox and Hyper-V do not play well together. You turn one on or you turn the other on. This is one of the problems with Xamarin Forms. If you target UWP, the UWP simulator uses Hyper-V. The Android emulator uses VirtualBox, which means you have to reboot your system to switch between debugging the two. It's kind of painful, but be aware that that is there, and it's unfortunately somewhat to be expected. And I didn't actually expect it to take quite this long to deploy. It should have been quicker, but what do I know? Yeah, it'll take it a moment to actually distribute and go across. It is worth knowing that the Android development stuff is always slow on a fresh build every single time because it recopies over all of the bits. There is we'll just dive into some specifics here real quick. And I can't open the project properties. There is a project property on the Android project for fast deployment. For debug builds, you absolutely want this turned on, because the fast deployment will take what it thinks the deltas are and only ship those bits up. And about 99% of the time, it gets it right. That 1% of the time, you got to do a full rebuild and redeploy and resend everything because it's lost it in its mind and can't figure out which end is up. Again, most of the time when I run into problems, the solution is clean, rebuild, and if that doesn't work, restart Visual Studio, clean, rebuild. And it's thinking, it is deploying, something's being copied, everyone's happy. It is worth knowing that my emulator here is set at a very low resolution. So just be aware that I have not encountered an Android device that has a resolution this low, but I do a lot of testing, and this is my minimum supported resolution, so I like to test on it to make sure things work correctly, and then I know that if it scales up, I'll be fine. Okay. So just poking through some of this XAML real quick to go through and lay it out. This is mimicking the cut list page that we saw over here. So for this functionality, we've got a couple drop downs. In Xamarin Forms land, these are called pickers. But the thing with pickers is the way you pick an item on iOS and on Android is very, very different. And you're still thinking. On iOS, you get a little, I don't know what you call it, a circular wheel down at the bottom of your screen where you can flick through everything. Anyone's worked with some of the kind of like the native date pickers is kind of familiar with being able to pick something like that. Whereas on the Android one, assuming this launches, we're thinking about it. Also worth noting, my voice is not dead yet. Also worth noting is that the performance while debugging is severely handicapped. So do not do any performance benchmarks with a debug build with a debugger attached. You will get nothing close to accurate. Your performance goes up significantly when we're talking about release builds and no debugger attached. Oh, you are awesome. Okay. Let's go over here real quick and just take a quick look. So, the XAML for the main page is pretty simple. And once again, this is that whole idea of I have shared UI code, not necessarily a shared look and feel. So I've got this funny pink color. I've got the default blue up at the top. But my view itself is just a table view with a couple sections, and each section contains a button. The buttons themselves do nothing fancy. They just push a page onto the stack, and we navigate. Okay? So we'll do the most boring page possible, the About page. So the only interesting thing about the About page, we've got some block of text, and then the how do I email Grant because I'm unhappy with this app? Or because I want to give him lots of money and thank him. You know, pick your favorite. In this case, we tap on the link, and it actually pops up with an email prompt. Now, this is one of those first areas where it's, I want to do something platform specific. But right now, my About page lives in my shared project. Sending an email, that's a common thing that you would do on either platform. So, let's take a look. So in the text, we just watch for when that gets tapped. And there's this wonderful email compose async. I cannot think of a way of making sending email any simpler than one line of code. However, this is not coming from Xamarin Forms. Xamarin realized a long time ago that there was a lot of these common platform pieces that people were rewriting over and over and over because they wanted access to native platform APIs, but they wanted to do it from a shared project. Because the shared project doesn't know anything about Android, doesn't know anything about iOS. Usually you have to do something fancy with events or dependency injection to be able to get back out to those platform libraries to do something platform specific. So what Xamarin did, and we're just going to jump back over here because I'm on a roll, is they built something called Xamarin Essentials. Thank you. Now, this NuGet package is still marked as pre-release. However, every API that I've used out of it has been very, very stable. I'm not entirely sure why it is still pre-release. And let's just go like this. And I'm sure there's other ones that you can think of device-specific stuff that you might want to access. App information, battery, clipboard, compass, tracking, email, file systems, flashlight, gyroscope, launcher. You can do threading, maps, browsers, phone dialers, preference, screen lock, SMS, text-to-speech. In my opinion, this is a must-have library if you are doing Xamarin Forms development. You no longer have to write the native code to go through and interact with these things. You just pull in Xamarin Essentials. For example, we'll pick on our email one. And they tell you exactly what you have to do. A using statement. And then if you want, you can blindly copy their code. Now, if I was intelligent, I would have actually grabbed the catch block. Because if I run my code on a platform where this is not supported, it's going to crash the whole app. This is one of those cases where copy and paste is better than just writing the code yourself. Has anyone had to do this, dealing with platform-specific stuff from a shared library before? Or is this kind of new? This is one of those areas in Xamarin Forms that's deceptively difficult because the bar for entry is way down here. But to do it well requires knowledge up here. Because normally to go through and do this type of logic, you end up having to write your own interface and via some sort of dependency injection, pass that down from your head into the shared library. So you write some sort of email sender interface. And on Android, you implement it one way. And on iOS, you implement it another way and pass it in. That's painful. The fact that Xamarin has gone through and done all of the hard work is amazing. This is a wonderful library. Any questions? I feel like this is, everyone's quiet. It's okay to talk. My voice is dying, but I'm sure yours isn't.
Are there any device features there that, are there any lacking that you want to use?
Yes, camera. That's a noticeable admission right here.
Are there plans to?
So I filled out a survey for Xamarin Forms a while back where they were asking what are the features that you want to see in Xamarin Essentials, and camera was one of the things on the list. I'm hoping me and everyone else who filled out the survey all mark that box. And camera is a bit of a specific one because for us, the one time I used it, I was doing computer vision through the live stream of the camera feed. Most people don't want that. Most people might want something that's actually in here, which is pick a picture from my picture library. That's fine. That's a little bit more common, and it kind of gives a workaround if you don't have access to it. But for the Xamarin Forms app that we built that used that, all we did is we built the same sort of, and I don't remember my type names off the top of my head, but something like an iCamera interface that was then implemented differently for iOS and Android, and then passed that into my shared class library. And so I built the interface to look as nice as I could, C#, and then had to do a whole bunch of platform-specific stuff. But that was definitely much more complex. Acting on the live video stream coming off the camera sensor to do some sort of like augmented reality is a lot more difficult than what I would ever expect them to implement here. I would expect them to implement something like pop the camera to take a picture and feed me back the image data. Something like that's a little bit more of a common interface. But it's also worth knowing, with Xamarin Forms, if you want to go through and do something like augmented reality with ArcKit, you totally can do that inside of Xamarin Forms. Okay? You still end up having to go back to platform code, and you're going to be writing code in that Xamarin iOS head to interact with ArcKit, because ArcKit is definitely not cross-platform. It's iOS only. But you can still get at it. All of those APIs are there. They do have samples that actually go through and demonstrate some of that. So it's probably actually in the iOS specific docs. But there are samples down near the bottom, sample apps that are worth going through. They're worth going and poking through to see how to do things. And remember, just because you don't see an example inside of the Xamarin Forms docs, go and look at the platform-specific docs as well. Because Xamarin Forms is on top of these other two platforms. So if you can do it in the platforms, you can do it in Xamarin Forms. More questions? Anything? Man, you guys are not letting my voice get a good rest.
Does the essential stuff have abstractions for watch things like step counters and heart rate?
So, kind of. So.
On Android, there isn't really a standard for that yet.
Right, and that's sort of the problem. They have access for particular device types, but I don't think step counters on the list. I'd probably have to check. I would not be surprised if something like the Geo stuff worked.
Well, they have the accelerometer.
Yeah. And it's worth knowing that just because the API is there, don't ever make the assumption that your device supports it. On iOS, you can make a few more assumptions about what your device has based upon your iOS version number-ish. You can kind of make some generalized assumptions because Apple constrains their hardware. On Android, you can basically make no assumptions whatsoever that you have access to any hardware because somebody will try to launch it on some custom device where the manufacturer stripped out modules A, B, and C for reasons. So on most of these, you'll notice, especially the hardware-specific stuff, that it does go through and they're usually catching some sort of not implemented exception or not supported on this platform, that kind of thing. You definitely want to handle those cases. Okay? But the Xamarin Essentials documents are very clear on what you need to actually go through and bring in these APIs to work with and what it takes to actually use them. And most of the time, it's a using statement. We can't make it any easier. I suppose we could write the code, but that would be way too easy. Okay, so we'll just abandon the email for the moment. And this is one of those other areas that you'll notice that I haven't actually done anything to get this title bar along the top. I haven't done anything to do that back arrow. I haven't done anything magical to handle the hardware back button. Take my word for it, on iOS, it looks like an iOS app with the header bar. Going back to the view, it actually displays the correct view's title. Now there is this little bit about these weird colors. You don't see these same colors on iOS. And this is one of those areas where Xamarin Forms low bar of entry, but requires knowledge up here. So it lets you get in and start working really fast, but in order to actually go through and change the theme, you do need to understand something about the platform. So on Android, we actually have buried up here is the manifest. Let's just pin you for the moment so I can see what I'm doing. And resources, layout. Please don't open the designer. Please don't open the designer. You are not helpful. Less helpful. So once again, the designer is not. Let's see, where is my assets and drawing colors? There we are. So, buried under all of these Android layouts, for those of you who have seen a default Android project, all of these folders will look familiar to you. There's a whole bunch of stuff for, I needed an image at various resolutions. Here's where I put stuff. Here's how I control which ones are going to get displayed, which ones are going to get bundled into my app. But buried all the way back in these colors and styles are the material design default brushes. And take my word for it, these correspond to that lovely light Xamarin blue color that we saw and the beautiful fuchsia that works so well in so many apps. Thank you. Somebody chuckled. So, if you're wanting to actually go through and theme your app out, you can do it in a couple different ways. You can go through on the Xamarin Forms side and set your colors there. And that'll get most of the theme all the way through. But to actually theme out the whole app, like this little bar up here, you're going to then have to go back into your Android app and deal with things like the Android theme colors to get those to align correctly. You run into a similar thing on iOS, where you've got the idea of their bar where you can go transparent and have your app float behind it, or you can actually fix it and have your app go underneath it. iOS 9, I think, added that feature. Don't quote me. But there still is these times where you have to go back and understand how the native platform is working. With Xamarin Forms, it's important to understand you have a native app, but that native app's purpose in life is render Xamarin Forms stuff. In Xamarin Forms world, that largely corresponds to these pages.
It's okay.
Yep.
Working in Android, a lot of times I've had to do, like, you have to work with intents to send things between different things, like email, for example. You showed an example of email being sent with one line. Normally, if I was in Android, I'd have to create an intent that would open my email app and pass that information off with my email app. So,
Yep.
is that kind of that whole experience kind of gets reduced to the one line type stuff in Android, or is there like an
Absolutely.
intense kind of
So,
system?
so the Xamarin Essentials, specifically for this email example, yes, under the hood, that's what this is doing. So this email compose async is a shared API, but then on Android, it goes through and it builds out that intent for you to forward on to the email. On iOS, it goes through their API to send it out.
Well, that did not burst your bubble, but email compose async isn't supported on iOS. It throws the feature not supported.
Awesome.
So they don't want you to send email.
Sorry, you're making me. Sorry, you mock my app right out the gate.
That's why it's in preview.
Interesting. I am very surprised that that isn't documented here.
Well, and it may be only on iOS 12.1.
So that is also another thing to be aware of too. If you are and another great reason to always test on a physical device, what you have access to on, say, the simulator on iOS doesn't always match, and oftentimes is very different than what you will get on a device. So there are some things that you just flat out cannot test on the simulator, and you have to go to a physical device. So I usually try to test on those as much as possible.
So kind of along the line of my first question about the intents. So let's say I wanted to send image to Slack or send it to text message. How does that, I want to give them the choice of that. Where would I go to find the ability to choose?
So state that one more time. So you've got some,
I've got one
some
image
text.
in my app.
Yep.
And I want to share it for either on Messenger or on Slack. I want to provide that menu. Again, it's along that idea of the intents and choosing.
Yes.
I mean, what would I look for, I guess, in...
And I think the answer is it's probably app-specific code at this moment. I think data transfer is what we're looking for.
Can you just go share when the user chooses?
Yeah, so this is ultimately what you're looking for, is the data transfer
Yeah.
API in Xamarin Essentials.
Perfect, yeah, sorry.
So you build up this sharing request and then let the operating system take over to say, user pick, here's the type of content I have, what apps do I have that support this? So, you've got Facebook that'll take in a text versus Twitter or something. But again, Xamarin Essentials has taken all of that complexity, smoothed over all of the platform weirdness of needing to know I do this on Android and this on iOS, and tried to boil everything down to as absolutely stupid simple as they could make it.
I think
Again.
down below there it kind of shows some of that.
Yeah, of what the interfaces end up looking like. And then also be aware that there are things that are worth paying attention to, because they will call out specifically if things are known to not work on a given platform. In all cases, they'll mention it, which is why that email on iOS surprised me, because I didn't see docs on it. Or various properties that might not get used in each case. Because again, each platform is a little different, and they're trying to make a common API that just happens to work. Okay, let's jump back. So, I think we were going here. So we've got all of this XAML, and I'm not going to bore you guys with going through and reading all of it. But the important part here is that on this back end side, we've got this settings class, because we've got these various values that we're working with. And this is one of the things that the original Cordova app did, is when the user picked values, it stored them off in the local storage inside of JavaScript, which gets persisted between launches of the application. Not a long-term persistent storage, more of a temporary, I just want to remember where the user was at state. And if you're familiar with native development, saying when my app gets suspended, I want to save some data. When it gets resumed, I want to reload that amount of state. That's actually a lot of work on native app development. And in a lot of cases, Xamarin Forms just handles it for you. So trying to reload the page that they were on, trying to reset your settings, Xamarin Forms more or less will reload that information for you. Not always. There is some user-specific stuff that you're going to have to handle yourself. But let's take a look at this settings class, because this is one that I actually wrote. So nothing fancy, it's just a straight up static class. But you'll notice that it's referencing, and we'll go down to the bottom, all of these properties are calling into this application current properties. This is a Xamarin Forms class that's just a straight up dictionary of string object. Okay? You can stuff anything in it you want. And when your app ends up getting backgrounded, Xamarin Forms will go through the effort of saying, hold on, or 1 second, let me serialize that out to disk. And then when your app is resumed, let me reload that for you. You don't have to deal with the application lifecycle. You can do exactly what you want, which is, I just want to persist this data. I want it to save. When my app reloads, please load that dictionary back up for me. I don't want to have to deal with these various different bits of iOS and Android. And this is one of those wonderful areas where Xamarin Forms has taken an arguably very complex API on both iOS and Android and made it very simple. Now, it's worth knowing that just because you can put anything in this dictionary doesn't mean that anything's just magically going to work. You have to put in serializable types, otherwise it's not going to know which end is up and not going to serialize them. It's not going to error, it's just going to ignore them, and when you come back, those things they'll be null. Now, it's worth noting that when you're using this dictionary, especially if you're testing on an emulator, if you hit stop on your debugger, that kills the app. Your settings are not being persisted. The forms only goes through and actually persists those settings when your app actually gets suspended or backgrounded. And then it only reloads them when the app relaunches. So if you're using the debugger and trying to figure out why is this not working, stop using the stop button and actually, launch the app without debugging, background it, let it die, relaunch it, verify your settings get loaded. Okay? So let's take a look at this guy here. So most of these pickers just go through, modify the settings, and call calculate, which I won't bore you with a bunch of math. I copied it straight from the JavaScript and translated it into C#, which was not too difficult. And it does math and builds out a whole bunch of numbers. Okay? Now, let's see. Board feet page. So let's look at this guy here. Come on, go ahead and load. Thank you. So we've got this other UI where we can drag sliders around, change values, maths, lots of maths, and then outcomes number at the bottom, right? Now if we look at our XAML, we'll notice we've got something over here that looks a whole lot like CSS. It's because it is CSS. For those of you who just listened to me talk about WPF and styles earlier, I mentioned that you can't do CSS in XAML. In Xamarin Forms, that is not the case. Because so many people coming to Xamarin Forms are coming from that web background, coming from things like Cordova or PhoneGap, Xamarin Forms said, okay, well, we're going to try and make your life a little bit easier. You're already used to styling elements with CSS. That's how you've done it before. So I literally took the CSS that was being run inside of the Cordova app and just copied it straight in to my app and wrapped it up in this nice little style sheet. I did have to change the target so that it was pointed at the right frame at the very bottom, which is this guy down here. But then, magically, all of my frames in here get this styling. Now, you cannot quite style everything in Xamarin Forms with CSS. You can do the vast majority of it. There's still a few edge cases where you can't set things up quite the same way, and you have to go and actually set the properties in your XAML. But for anybody with web background, this can make styling your app significantly easier. You don't have to inline your CSS here. You can have a CSS file as just an embedded reference for your project and use that to go through and style your app. And you get all of the fancy CSS magic for merging your styles together and using them. Okay? You'll notice this is roughly the equivalent of what it takes to go through and do the same type of styling in XAML. So with CSS, we styled all of the frames to look a particular way. In this case, we only had one frame at the very bottom. And then with the XAML style, we go through and set up a bunch of colors for the trackers back and forth. This is one of the biggest advantages to using XAML versus C# to build your UIs, is you can do global level theming and styling. You can also get things called compiled bindings. So normally, if you're binding objects inside of your XAML, they're being evaluated at runtime. Xamarin Forms, last release, added compiled bindings. So now, if you mistype a binding path, you'll get notified at compile time that you've made a mistake, rather than running the app and waiting for the binding to fail later. This dramatically cuts down on any errors that you have. You rename a property in your backing view model, and it just works. Now, it's worth knowing with the compiled bindings, it's only going to notify you of the first error. So if you've got 14 errors in your file, you're going to go one by one, and it's only going to notify you of the first one. As it's running through, as soon as it hits the first error, it just bails early. So there's a feature request for them to improve that and display everything, but that gets kind of hard and complicated. But at least it'll catch you at compile time, going one at a time. Okay? The compiled bindings are enabled with an xData type attribute. For people with UWP backgrounds, this is roughly akin to xbind. Okay? The problem is it's not quite xbind. So you get the performance benefits. Try this here. My voice will make it, I promise. I've gotten this far. You get the performance benefits of a compiled binding that's checked at compile time. But it's not the same in the way that it wires up and works. And there are a few known bugs with it, where it gets a little overly aggressive and replaces bindings that it shouldn't. Okay? And once again, I'm not gonna go through and bore you with the differences, but the key part here is it knows that this width property lives on this view model. And it can check all of that at compile time. As somebody who's used to working with other XAML frameworks, I wish this existed elsewhere. In a working form, not in its current form, but that's what I would like. And for UWP, it mostly exists. Okay, so let's back out of this guy here real quick. And we'll jump into just something simple as settings. So on our settings page, let me bounce this down because this is hard to look at. Thank you. Too many. So on our settings page, it's a pretty simple setup. On all of the Xamarin Forms pages, you have appearing and disappearing, I believe, are the two method names that you can override. This is roughly the equivalent of managing your application lifecycle in Xamarin Forms. But again, it's a much simpler idea. Is my page showing up? Load some data. Is my page going away? Maybe save some state or do something with it. You don't have to do a whole lot of work to go along with it. When the setting changes, toggle. Okay. On the switch cell, just change my setting for me. And more importantly, there's this idea of a value converter. So people who are familiar with MVVM style framework coding, where you're binding two things together, quite often the two properties that you're binding, their types don't match. That happens a lot. Rarely is the type on thing A matching the type on thing B. But normally we can coalesce them and make them match. So in this case, we have a Boolean, and what we really want to show the user is, okay, are we talking about the bottom or the right side of the blade, or are we talking about the top and the left? And so on our individual bindings, we can just specify a converter, and away we go. Now this is a highly specific, very simplistic app. But to take it from Cordova to Xamarin Forms took a little under 2 hours. It was not a complicated endeavor to do.
Yes, foot pedals.
Yeah, I type with all 4 limbs.
So, quick update. Email compose thing does work on iOS if you set up an email account first.
Oh yeah,
So it throws the Xamarin Essentials feature.
not implemented. Oh yeah,
If you don't have a.
yes. Very, very
It's a
true.
little confusing. Back to your point of.
Yeah, sometimes you get error messages that don't make a lot of sense. Okay. Something else worth noting and going through, there are documentation pages for both Xamarin iOS and Android. Specifically, let's back up here. Jump in. I'll pick on Android first. But there's this deployment and testing box there's an equivalent one on iOS. These are worth working through before you go and actually build out your app and submit to the store. There's actually quite a bit here to make sure that you've dotted all your I's and crossed all of your T's. So the Google Play Store is fairly forgiving about what it lets in. The Apple Store is much more picky. If you walk through these steps, you'll have minimal issues. The Stay Alfred app, when we submitted, I think it took me 3 tries working through this, and it went through no problem. I had no rejection from either store. Because both of the stores will do some amount of static analysis and say, hey, by the way, you forgot to set a title for this. You need a screenshot at this resolution showing your app at this. And Xamarin will go through and line it all out. One other thing that's worth mentioning, because it's a very easy one to bite yourself with, making web calls. So making web calls in a Xamarin app is no different than making a web call in your console app or your WPF app. You still use your system.net.http client. But the thing to remember is HTTP client is itself an abstraction over making an HTTP call. It goes through and there's a message handler inside of it that tells it, here's how to handle the message. Now for Xamarin, that matters a lot. Because depending on what that message handler is, you're going to get very different behavior. So there's, once again, a couple links posted in both of them. And you'll notice on the Android one, there's a big scary warning right out the gate saying, by the way, HTTPS, you need to set your message handler or you're going to start getting blocked by stuff. So in your project properties, they will give you different choices for what type of message handler do you want. And in general, I believe the latest project templates have the right ones selected for what you need. On iOS, the answer is pretty simple. You go down and you take the NSURL session option. That's what's recommended. That's the fast native one. That's the one that has all of the fancy security support. That's the one you want to use. On Android, the story gets a little more complicated. You probably want the Android client handler, but it really depends on how old of Android you want to support. And this is always kind of one of the weird issues because Android has a huge sprawl of users. iOS really motivates people upgrade, 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 upgrade. So only a small portion of iOS users are ever running old devices, old technology. Android users, you'll get a bigger spread. So you probably want the Android client handler, assuming that you are targeting Android 5.0 and above, which is fairly reasonable at this point. Because I think 6 is Marshmallow, and most stuff nowadays is probably running at least Marshmallow. Most, I haven't checked output of each of them. Questions? You're supposed to raise your voice at the end for the question mark, and I'm doing my best at that. Yeah.
Is there one of the things that has built in, maybe in the essentials, is a video player on this?
Video player. That is a great question. The answer is a definite maybe. I am not aware of one right out the gate. There is and I think this one might be targeted, this one might be specific to Xamarin Mac. Yeah, this is not for mobile. Let's jump back and take a look. I do not think that there is a built-in video player on either side. Now, with that said, I know most of them can. Like Android itself, most distros will have FFmpeg bundled in, which will play just about anything. But I do not think there's a built-in one for it. If you are interested, talk to me afterwards, get me your email address. I have another developer friend that has just recently built something like this on all 3 platforms, and I can ask what they ended up doing. They tend to home roll some of their stuff, but I know that they got something working across iOS and Android. And UWP for what that's worth. What else? Yeah.
Right, so I know the team with, this was the mobile side of development. But so I'm student Eastern, currently doing my senior project, and basically we're decided to create this Windows native app. So jumped into it, like okay, WPF. So looking at how this talk, why use Xamarin Forms for my instance, because I'm not as interested in the cross-platform aspects. So you mentioned the CSS thing there, and I guess potentially some of these essentials I could utilize. But is there anything else that I should consider?
So a large number of the Xamarin Essentials aren't going to get you anything on a WPF app. It's worth noting that Xamarin Forms for WPF is still preview. So I would probably discourage you from trying to build a project that you're going to show off to somebody with it at this point. Based on your description, I would probably say straight WPF is probably better off. But I'd be interested in hearing more about your project after. What else? Is this helpful?
Sort of along the same lines with the essential stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know if there's any for getting like ads in your app?
Ooh. So there are There are samples for the native platform projects showing you how to go through and do that. I don't think I've ever seen one for forms. So you may end up having to dive back and forth. And that's so something I've mostly skimmed over because you probably need to avoid it is ways of actually putting native platform stuff into your Xamarin Forms app. So there's actually several choices. Choice A, just drop it straight in the XAML. With the Xamarin Forms 3.2.0 that came out 3 or 4 months ago, you can take a native iOS or Android control and just drop it right in your XAML. And then on Android, it'll render the Android control. On iOS, it'll render the iOS control. If it's on a different platform, it just ignores it, which is great. Now, with that said, it's one of those features that sounds really good, but kind of difficult to use. Because as soon as you drop it in, the next question is, well, how do I register for this event? How do I work with it? And inside of a shared project, it doesn't work very well. Inside of a shared asset project where you can do your pound if Android, pound if iOS, it works much better. Also worth knowing is you do have to so by default on Xamarin Forms, all of your pages get this XAML compilation attribute specified to compile. This is great because you get compiled XAML and it's much faster. The drawback being that you can't use the embedded native controls inside of it. You have to turn this off for it. The other options are there's things called effects that let you go through and tweak the native controls without dealing with a bunch of the native platform stack stuff. If it's one of those, hey, I really just want to put an underline on this, Xamarin Forms doesn't support, a font underline option, but I know my platform does. You can put it on effects, and that lets you go to platform code very easily back and forth. The last bigger option is you go with what's called a renderer. That's the layer inside of Xamarin Forms that sits between your Xamarin Forms UI and your native controls. That's what's doing that translation going back and forth, is all of these built-in renderers. Now, you can decide that you don't like Xamarin Forms renderers and replace them with your own. You can write your own. But once you start writing a renderer, you really want to derive from their existing renderers because there's not a lot of good documentation showing you here's the pitfalls of writing one from just bare bones scratch. It's kind of difficult to get everything right because you are then in charge of synchronizing your native UI with your Xamarin Forms UI. And that's not always a trivial thing to do. But because you can write your own renderers, you can dive to native stuff inside of Xamarin Forms and do something very different. That camera app that I mentioned where we did kind of the augmented reality with the camera stream, that's what we did. Is we had a Forms control and custom renderers for iOS and Android. That way, inside of my renderer, I could do whatever platform-specific stuff I needed to get a hold of the camera, do my drawing and everything. And my Forms control may have passed me some data of, here's the color thing that I want, but, convert that to platform stuff. We're going to do platform-specific rendering here. I kind of deviated a little bit from your question. That kind of cover it somewhat? More questions? Is anyone here considering starting a new app in the nearish future? Going once, going twice, a couple hands, maybe? Okay, Cordova one. What about you? Okay, personal projects or company?
No, for my company. I'm not as well. Don't even.
Fair enough. Is this helpful? Is this kind of...
You didn't mention GTK.
GDK
GTK.
for...
GNOME Windows UI. It's a new preview target for Xamarin Forms.
That's because I didn't know that one existed.
So you can add Linux to the platform. The platform list.
So apparently building Linux desktop apps with Xamarin Forms is now a thing too, or at least is in preview.
Are there more UWP apps or Linux GNOME apps?
In the course of history,
Yes.
probably.
Let me count Windows Phone apps.
Hey, I got a Windows phone in my pocket still. I'm probably the only holdout in the room, aren't I? Yes! There's
Windows
two of
Store
us.
apps on your Windows devices.
Although disclaimer.
Right, so
It's okay. I'm getting ready to go there myself.
You know, perhaps worth mentioning, right, UWP is a Windows Store app. Windows 10 Store is UWP. Right, WPF is going to be a quote Windows native app.
Windows desktop app.
Windows desktop app, sorry. So, you know, UWP is not just for the Windows phone.
Yeah, because you can build desktop.
Pushing LLP, a lot of business apps with the
Yeah.
Yeah. And UWP is largely expected to be the replacement for WPF, and it's getting really, really close to feature parity. There's a lot of things UWP does better than WPF. Specifically, the graphics engine, it doesn't suffer from some of the same performance hits that WPF can. It can take advantage of the new fluent design that you see in Windows 10, specifically that kind of, they call it material, where it's kind of that weird opaque showing all the way through. You can't get a really good equivalent of that in WPF. And part of it is because they have better control of the graphics pipeline, they can do that in UWP.
Do you know if .NET Core 3, kind of, how does that relate with the stuff they're releasing on, the WinForms
So
and Xamarin and stuff?
Yeah, so .NET Core 3, as it stands, at least the last update that I saw, I think it was last week, they are planning on supporting multiple desktop platforms being able to target it. So things like UWP, WPF, things that are still kind of, or I guess UWP isn't stuck on the old one, WPF specifically, or WinForms that are stuck on old .NET framework and can't take advantage of the new .NET Core performance boosts, will be able to target it. It doesn't magically make them cross-platform by any stretch of the imagination.
It's still Windows.
It's still a Windows desktop application, but it means that you can bundle your runtime with your app and take advantage of the performance increases. So you're no longer waiting for some sysadmin to install Net Framework vNext for you. You can just distribute your runtime with your app.
Yeah, I'm just curious kind of how, if Xamarin played into that at all.
So
XAML itself.
So XAML, not so much. Xamarin is largely disjointed from it because they are built with the mono runtime for iOS and Android. But with that said, the mono runtime usually revs right with the C# one and keeping up. There's been minimal differences between them. So, but again, you can write your net standard project with your shared code and then use it in whatever app you want. Other questions? I'm curious, what type of apps are people building? Anyone? Angular, okay. Somewhat helpful. Yeah.
I've been working on just like an API client, and I originally wasn't gonna have any sort of like GUI or anything for it. It was just gonna be like command line based. But with your class and this talk, I'm thinking of trying to add that into it.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
So if after, if anybody wants to look at the stay out for that, I can get with Kevin too, and he can kind of talk about some of the development things we've done with it. We've got like a gallery in there. We've got some integration with maps in there.
Yep.
That was all done with Xamarin. And
Yep.
in that case, we used a backend that was serving our Angular website to host all the data for the Xamarin.
Yeah, the other thing that's is somewhat interesting about that one is Xamarin has released Skia Sharp. So if people are familiar with Skia, it's the drawing and rendering library that backs a lot of Android. But they've released it as a cross-platform library that you can now use inside of your iOS and Android apps. So like for their app, rather than dealing with image assets on the various resolutions for iOS and Android and going through and adding them to all the correct folders and getting the right resolutions, what we ended up doing is taking most of our assets, making them SVGs, and using Skia Sharp to render them. Because now I don't care. If I have it as an SVG and I can render at any resolution, I don't care. I can scale back and forth. Makes it much easier, and then I don't have to care, once again, one less platform-specific thing that I actually have to deal with. I can kind of ignore that and treat it with impunity as much as I want to.
Development speed, a tribute to both your team's work as engineers, but also to Xamarin was very fast. We started this project, was it in March? And we finished it in September? All the way to the app stores.
Yeah, that was file new project and then submit to store. So.
Both stores.
So it's
Yeah,
still,
both
really new, so keep that in mind.
But I'm sure they would not mind if people wanted to download it and see.
Yeah.
Like I said, if people want to see those apps, I can give you store links to them. And if nothing else, just check out the previews. A lot of times you cannot tell a Xamarin app from a native app. It is really, really hard. That is not something that you can say about an app written with, say, Cordova. Because a lot of those JavaScript apps, you fire them up, and the first thing you notice is, oh, this isn't a native UI. This looks funny. Or you fire it up and you go, oh, this looks like an iOS app on Android. This feels weird. Like, you get that right away. On a Xamarin app, you do not have that.
So there are currently 6,784 packages on NuGet.org that contain Xamarin Informants.
6,000 packages, that's not bad. We can do better. Because that's the other thing too, is you do get to leverage any NuGet package that can target net standard, which is a vast majority of them at this point, you can leverage inside of your Xamarin app. So we get the breadth of everything that C# has to offer, plus everything NuGet has to offer. And because we can also reference third-party libraries and build up a binding to those as well, we can now take advantage of everything in, say, CocoaPods as well. That's a huge swath of code that we have access to. Now, it's worth knowing, referencing a native third-party library is not necessarily trivial. So it does take a lot of work. I had to reference OpenCV because nobody had distributed it normally because it's a massive library. You end up having to build what's called a binding library, which basically goes from C# into native land. And you have to actually do that mapping. The very same thing that Xamarin's doing automatically for you for all the new SDKs for iOS and Android, you have to build that for whatever third-party library you want. Now, in a lot of cases, those third parties have probably already done it for you. Xamarin's big enough that most mobile library developers have figured out that they really need to support it, because if they don't, they're going to miss out on a lot of people. So before you go and write a binding library, definitely poke around. Somebody else is probably beating you to it.
Good to go.
Good to go. Most people have got
Thank
more
you, Kevin.
questions. I'm after if people want to chat.